You in black think you can wear a uniform? Take it off before I rip it apart right here. Randall Hale roared into Lyria Dawson's face under the stunned eyes of the neighbors and the battlefield dog struggling to stay upright on its last breath. Then, boom, he pulled the trigger without a flicker of hesitation, taking down the only creature that had ever shielded her in combat, completely unaware that a camera had captured the military police tattoo on her arm. Lyria rose to her full height, her face sharp as a blade. "You just shot the dog of a Navy SEAL." Randall stepped back half a pace, his face drained as a man hearing the final charges of his life read aloud. This was no longer about skin color. It was the moment a reckless man who thought he was the law felt truth tightening around his throat bit by bit. Want to see how he gets crushed? Scroll down now. The midday heat felt as if the ground were smoldering under the sun. The residential road was quiet, with only the sound of dry leaves brushing lightly against the pavement as the wind slipped through. In the patrol car, Randall Hale leaned back in his seat with the bored posture of a man far too accustomed to long days with nothing to feed his hunger for authority. That changed when the radio crackled to life with a call reporting a violent altercation a few blocks away. A single short sentence was enough to make his spine straighten as if someone had injected him with a shot of bloodlust. He jerked the steering wheel, slammed the accelerator, and sped off. His chin tilted up slightly, his lips twitching as though he were smiling because he finally had an excuse to step out and do what he loved most, which was to corner someone weaker than himself. The car stopped at the reported spot. Randall looked around, searching for signs of a fight. But the street was empty to an irritating degree. No shouts, no one running, no sound of frantic breaths cutting through the hot wind. Only silence mocking him. He called back the number of the person who had reported the incident, but the phone was switched off. Randall clenched his jaw as if he had to swallow an insult whole, then slammed his hand against the steering wheel, the hollow plastic ringing with anger. His face flushed as if someone had slapped him hard. To anyone else, this might have been a pointless prank pulled by someone with too much free time, but to Randall, it was humiliation he could not stomach. He hissed a curse through his tight breaths, a curse not aimed at anyone in particular, but carrying the weight of a man who had long been used to standing on someone else's neck just to feel himself breathe. He shifted gears, turned the car around, and drove more slowly. As he headed back the way he came, his gaze swept along the street and locked instantly onto something. In the distance, under the thin shade of a leafless tree, a black woman was locking her car and walking with a large dark brown dog. The U.S. Army uniform on her body was still dusted with specks of dirt, and a few scratches on her arm suggested she had just finished a long trip. She bent down and tapped the dog's neck lightly, the kind of familiar touch belonging to someone who had spent years beside it. Baxter was visibly tired, moving slowly and breathing heavily. Even so, both of them carried a presence that did not bend easily. Lyria Dawson only meant to walk Baxter for a short distance to help him settle back into rhythm before going home to rest. On her drive back from the veterinary clinic, she had stopped for a few minutes to help a boy who had fallen off his bicycle. The child had scraped his knee, but it was not serious. She lifted the bicycle for him, examined the wound, asked a few questions to make sure he was not dizzy, and let him pedal away once she was sure he was fine. To her, it was nothing noteworthy, simply the reflex of someone who had grown far too familiar with far more devastating injuries in the place she had just returned from. Though it lasted only a brief moment, it was enough for Randall to look at her with the eyes of a predator spotting prey standing exactly where he wanted it. He turned off the engine, his hand resting on the car door, but he did not open it yet. He watched her from afar, his eyes narrowing. In that moment, the anger from being fooled merged with his deep-seated prejudice and spread through the cabin like toxic air. He curled his lip slightly, a smile just wide enough to reveal his contempt without needing a single word. He slammed the car door open, and the sound of it closing cracked through the air like a hammer striking steel. People living around here had seen Randall behave like this many times. Some had learned to watch through a slit in their windows just to avoid crossing paths with him. Randall's presence rarely brought anything good, and this time was no exception. Lyria stopped because she heard the car door slam. She turned her head, her eyes calm but sharply observant. It was not the look of fear or immediate defensiveness, but the assessment of someone long accustomed to evaluating a situation before making a move. She did not expect trouble. She had come home from duty, taken her dog to the clinic, helped someone, and only wanted to bring Baxter home to rest. No one imagined that this small pocket of peace would be dragged into a downward spiral because of a false emergency call and a cop searching for someone to unload his anger on. Randall walked toward her with heavy steps, the steady clack of his black shoes hitting the pavement like a timed knock. In his eyes, there was no attempt to hide his resentment. He looked at her from head to toe, ignoring the fact that she was walking a dog fresh from the clinic or that she was wearing an actual uniform. He only saw what he wanted to see: a black woman standing near a home he believed did not belong to her. Lyria stayed still. Baxter looked up at her, then at the man approaching. The dog seemed to sense that something was wrong. He stayed at her side, not growling or reacting violently, but his breathing changed slow yet deep, as if preparing for an uncertain threat he could not yet define. Randall stopped in front of her. He glanced at the dusty uniform and curled his lip. Instead of asking what she was doing here, he let the long-fermented sarcasm in his throat spill out in its full venom. The words snapped out like a slap. "Well, found the right type." His voice had a trace of amusement, as if after wandering around, failing to find someone to dump his anger on, he had finally stumbled upon the perfect excuse. A black woman, wrinkled, uniform, large dog. To an ordinary person, that was simply someone who had helped a child and taken her dog to the vet. But to Randall, it was an invitation to impose his authority without fear of pushback. Lyria did not answer immediately. She looked straight into his eyes, not challenging, not fearful. She simply looked to determine what he wanted, and that silence made Randall feel even more compelled to overpower her. No one in the neighborhood knew that this moment would become the beginning of a chain of events that would shake the entire community. A police officer looking for a target to absorb his rage, a returning soldier who only wanted to get her companion home, a dog that had seen more battlefields than family life, and a false emergency call that seemed meaningless but had accidentally pulled their paths into collision. This confrontation should never have happened, but it did, and it would open a door to something far more devastating in the parts that followed. Randall stepped out of the car with heavy, hurried strides, as if the pavement could barely bear the weight of the resentment swelling inside him. The moment both his feet hit the ground, his voice broke out without needing to see his target clearly, as if skin color and a uniform were all it took for his irritation to find something to cling to. He hurled his first line at Lyria with a cutting tone. "Cosplaying an American soldier, huh? A black woman daring to wear a real uniform." The words dropped into the scorching air so heavy that a bird perched on a nearby power line startled and flew off. It was not a question, but a judgment spoken aloud. An ordinary person might have stepped back or reacted on instinct, but Lyria did not. She stood upright, her eyes steady on him. She understood that someone like Randall was not here to ask, but to search for a reason to stand over someone else. She simply answered, her voice soft but clear. "I am wearing what is mine." No trembling, no further explanation. Randall heard that and felt an even hotter surge rise in his chest, because to him a black woman given a short answer like that was no different from refusing submission. He curled his lip, then glanced down at Baxter. The dog stood pressed close to Lyria's leg, head slightly lowered, but his eyes tracked Randall's every move. Baxter's breathing was slower after the long trip, but his body remained in its natural, trained alertness. Randall tilted his head to the side, his voice spreading with mocking amusement. "This one looks dangerous. Maybe you use it to scare the neighbors." He spoke as if convinced that everyone here would believe him, even though no one had seen a single threatening sign from Baxter. To Randall, reality mattered far less than shaping the story he wanted, and the story he was building was simple: a black woman with a large dog posing a danger to the neighborhood. He wanted those words to spread, wanted suspicion to fall on her, giving him more reason to tighten the noose. Lyria did not respond. She looked at him with a face that showed neither defiance nor compliance. Her silence irritated Randall more than anything she could have said. To him, someone else's silence was a form of challenge, and if there was anything he could not stand, it was the person in front of him remaining composed while he tried to push the situation upward. Randall took another step closer, near enough to see the dust still clinging to the shoulder of her uniform. He examined every detail with a gaze mixed with disdain and suspicion. In his mind, everything was ready to be used against her impersonating a soldier walking a dog without papers, wandering near someone else's home, even preparing to cause trouble. Everywhere he looked, he saw an excuse because he had been searching for one long before he stepped out of the car. Lyria kept her gaze calm, but not yielding. Her military instincts made her study Randall closely. She saw the way he stood, the way he breathed, the faint twitch of his fingers near his waist, as if he were waiting for the moment to push further. Every sign told her this was not a routine check. Randall was not here because of duty. He was here because the anger from the false call earlier had not found an outlet. At that moment, Baxter shifted closer to her leg. He did not growl or bare his teeth. He only shifted his weight like a soldier accustomed to danger at his handler's side on the battlefield. He did not understand Randall's words, but he understood the emotion spreading between the two humans facing each other. Randall saw that reaction and immediately twisted it into a justification in his mind. He jerked his chin up, his eyes glinting with a sense of advantage. "Oh, so this thing is used to scaring people." His voice carried the heat of the pavement thrown straight at Lyria's face. The woman kept the same expression. She could have said Baxter had just come from the clinic, could have said he had saved the lives of many of her teammates, could have said he was not aggressive, but she chose not to speak at all. Explanations from decent people often mean nothing to someone who has already decided he is the center of every truth. A few windows in the neighborhood cracked open. No one spoke. They watched to see what Randall would do, as if replaying a scene they had witnessed too many times where Randall was always the one in control and the other person was always forced into the losing side. But this time, the person standing before him was not like the others. Lyria's silence was not passive nor born of fear, but the quiet assessment of someone calculating every move. If Randall struck the wrong way, the consequences could slip out of his control. When Randall dipped his head, slightly narrowing the distance between them, Lyria saw the shift in his breathing clearly. It had become quicker, like someone preparing to lunge without a single justified reason. She recognized that even a small word or an unintentional gesture could become the excuse he needed to overpower her. But she did not give him that chance. Her composure made Randall feel dismissed. He pulled his head back, looking at her from top to bottom as if he had been insulted without a word. The feeling stretched every vein in him tight. He thought she saw him as someone not worth reacting to, and that angered him more than being tricked earlier. Randall's eyes revealed his fury as he spoke again, his voice scraping through his teeth. "What kind of attitude is that? You think I do not see through your little impersonation tricks?" The sentence ignited the tension that had been tightening by the second. The air between them grew heavier, as if every word Randall threw out pushed them closer to a real clash. Lyria watched him standing firm. She did not counter, did not step back, only held a steadiness that made it clear she stood before him as a human being, not an easy target to be bent on. And that was precisely what made Randall even more desperate to win. He had come here looking for a place to unload his anger, and he had chosen his target. No matter that she was walking a dog, tired to the point of heavy breathing, no matter that she had just helped a child who had fallen off a bike, no matter that the uniform on her body was real in his eyes, all of it was nothing more than a shell for him to tear apart. A brief silence passed. Then, what happened next would open the dangerous drop neither Randall nor anyone around them had anticipated. The air in front of Randall seemed to thicken as he stared hard at Lyria. Her calmness only fueled his need to peel back another layer of hostility. He lifted his chin slightly and let out a thin smile, the smile of someone who saw insulting others as a natural act. He glanced at the houses on both sides of the street and spoke loudly enough for anyone who happened to hear to believe she was a threat. Out spying on people's houses, huh? Planning to sneak in and steal things tonight. The words came out light, but carried the weight of the old prejudice he always dragged with him. Lyria understood he was trying to push her into the role of a suspicious intruder to justify whatever he wanted to do next. As soon as he finished speaking, a few thin curtains fluttered as those inside shifted to peek. Cautious eyes appeared briefly, then retreated, as if not wanting to get involved but still wanting to see what Randall would do. This neighborhood had long grown used to his behavior, the way he dumped his sudden anger on anyone who did not fit his liking, leaving everyone wary. Baxter stood beside Lyria, head lifting slightly at each word Randall threw out. The dog did not grasp the meaning but understood the tension spreading between them. He adjusted the placement of his paws as if making sure he stayed close to the person he saw as family. Lyria steadied her breathing, keeping her body in the most neutral state possible. She recognized that reacting too strongly would only give him exactly what he wanted, yet letting him continue with a few more provoking lines might push the situation into something far more dangerous. A door opened from the nearest house. Its old hinges produced a dry sound that drew the attention of both people facing each other. Mrs. Conway, who lived in the pale yellow house by the curb, stepped out with a face mixed with worry and surprise. She looked at Lyria, then at Randall. "Officer, what is going on?" Her voice was not loud, but carried the sincerity of someone who had seen too many disturbances that never ended smoothly. The question was not meant to challenge, but to ease the heavy air pooling in the street. But to Randall, anyone stepping in while he was cornering someone was enough to trigger a harsh reaction. He turned toward Mrs. Conway with a sharp glare as if she had just insulted him. "Close your door. This is not your business." The words burst from a throat tightened by anger. No thought, no courtesy, only irritation and the urge to push someone down to assert dominance. Mrs. Conway froze. Her eyes shifted between the two, then dropped to Bax, standing still like a loyal statue. She knew Baxter was gentle, having seen Lyria walk him past the house several times, always wagging his tail at the neighborhood children. But she also knew confronting Randall would only make things worse, especially when he was burning the way he was now. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly, as if squeezing out the last of her voice. "I just ask." Randall glared, his chest rising and falling heavily. "I said it is not your business." He threw in another line as if to make sure Mrs. Conway would not dare stand at her door any longer. She drew a small breath and stepped back inside the door, closing with a soft push, yet sounding as if it carried disappointment. She had lived on this street long enough to know that the less one said when Randall appeared, the safer it was, especially for anyone black in the area. Lyria tilted her head slightly as she watched Mrs. Conway retreat, then turned back to face Randall. That brief moment revealed a truth that did not need words. The whole neighborhood was used to this, used to the point where no one was surprised anymore. To Lyria, the image felt like a leftover from what she had seen in deployment zones where fear made people step back instead of standing up even when justice was clear. But here on American soil, that step back came from an ordinary citizen avoiding a police officer they should have been able to trust. Seeing Mrs. Conway vanish behind the door only bolstered Randall. He turned back toward Lyria, his breath blowing out sharply as if he intended to fill the entire space between them. "What are you doing here that makes the neighbors come out and look? Or maybe you thought this place was too quiet, so you decided to snoop around." He continued as if the previous line had not carried enough poison. "Or maybe you are planning to try your luck tonight." Lyria looked straight at him. His voice pressed against every shred of calm in her, but she did not allow herself to react while assessing the situation remained her priority. She shifted her shoulders slightly, planting her stance, her hands resting at her sides. "I am walking my dog. If you need something clarified, ask the right way." Randall barked out a laugh, dry and sharp. "Ask the right way. Someone like you thinks you deserve to be asked the right way." He repeated it as though it contained a long story of contempt for people he believed beneath him. He stepped closer, close enough for Lyria to catch the lingering scent of cigarettes in his breath mixed with the heat rising from the pavement. A few people stood behind their curtains. They watched without daring to pull them wider, like eyes hiding in the dark to avoid being dragged into the scene. And that sight made Lyria understand even more clearly what was happening. Randall was not only looking for an excuse to provoke her, but he was also performing the role of the man with power in front of those who had seen him do it countless times. Baxter shifted his weight subtly, head lifting, eyes fixed on Randall. The dog seemed to sense the rising tension. Lyria placed her hand on the part of his back near his shoulder in a small familiar gesture, the same way she had reassured him on the battlefield. The dog stayed still, but his ears were locked onto Randall. Every word the man spoke sending invisible tremors through him. Randall saw that movement and became even more convinced of the story he was inventing. He pointed at Baxter with a commanding gesture. "See that? It is getting ready to cause trouble." He said it to force the situation in the direction he wanted. No proof, no need for anyone to agree. He only needed to hear himself say it and use it as justification to keep pressing. A brief silence touched the space after that line, and that silence was the thin boundary before everything turned into another page, a page whose consequences Randall could not foresee. After Randall's accusatory remark, the air between them shifted entirely into another extreme. His hostility was no longer just sharp words. It began sliding into bare abuse of power, the kind many in the neighborhood had witnessed but never dared to intervene in. Countless eyes behind curtains continued watching, some afraid, some curious, but above all sensing they were witnessing something that would not end peacefully. Randall glanced around the street as if wanting to confirm that his authority had an audience. When he saw a few silhouettes pull back behind their windows, he grew even more arrogant, convinced he had no opposition. He stepped closer to Lyria and spoke in a cold voice, each word delivered like an order. "I have the authority to confiscate the dog and throw you in the car." Lyria heard every word pass through her ears, fully aware he was trying to force the situation into a corner where he could completely dominate. She straightened, choosing not to respond verbally to avoid being seen as defiant, but her eyes tracked every movement Randall made. The moment he finished speaking, Baxter shifted position. The dog took one step forward, not aggressive, not baring teeth, but standing in front of Lyria like a wall of bone and muscle that had once stopped bullets on a battlefield. Baxter's intervention only gave Randall more reason to inflate the story he was fabricating. He narrowed his eyes at the dog, then bent down almost to its level, his voice grinding through each syllable as if he were trying to stomp on the loyalty it showed its owner. "Exactly the kind of dog people like you have." The line carried a level of contempt so strong the entire street seemed to hear its venom drifting through the hot air. It targeted not only Baxter, but also Lyria and the community he had always viewed as beneath him. To Randall, pushing others down was how he proved he held power, especially when there was an invisible audience behind every window. Baxter did not react violently, but his entire body tightened as a rope pulled nearly to its limit. He did not bark. He only leaned forward slightly, offering the silent warning of an animal trained to stand between danger and its handler. His eyelids twitched when Randall bent down and his breathing grew heavier but controlled. Lyria looked down and recognized every familiar reflex. She placed a light hand on the top of his head, her fingers touching the exact spot trained to signal that everything must remain under control. The gesture was small but carried several layers of meaning. To Baxter, it was the battlefield command he knew well, the command to hold position, stay ready, but not surge ahead without the next cue. To Lyria, it was a way to steady the invisible bond between her and the companion who had followed her through too many life-or-death moments. And To Randall, the gesture felt like a silent challenge, making him jerk his head back sharply, his eyes filled with rising anger. "So that is how you train it, huh? Clearly a combat dog, very likely to attack at any moment." Randall spoke with a tone meant to pour fuel on the fire. The words were not only false, but crafted to brand Baxter as dangerous, so anything he chose to do next would be easier to justify. From the way he stood, the rhythm of his breathing, and the slight twitch in his jaw, Lyria understood he had made up his mind long before he approached her. A brief gap flashed between them, time tightening into a single held breath. Randall shifted his gaze away from Baxter and turned it on Lyria, cold and sharp, as if the dog was now only an excuse to focus on his real target. "You are showing disrespect toward someone performing official duty." His voice was not raised yet. It carried the weight of something worse approaching. Lyria did not step back. "I am standing on this ground as a citizen, and I am walking my dog. Say what you need to say properly." Her reply was steady, neither more nor less than the truth. What irritated Randall even further was the complete absence of fear. It was as if Lyria were speaking to an equal, not to him. To someone used to others bowing because of his authority, that composure pierced the swollen ego inside him like a thorn. Randall drew in a deep breath, but it only made his shoulders rise as if preparing to explode into aggression. "I do not need you preaching to me." He snarled the last word, then glanced down at Baxter with a look designed to push the dog into being perceived as a threat. Lyria felt the situation edging into danger. She glanced at Baxter again. The dog's eyes were locked on Randall, but his body had steadied after her earlier command. The bond between them told her he would not move unless Randall crossed a line no loyal animal could tolerate. A few windows shifted again. People in the neighborhood continued watching without stepping outside. This was not the first time they had seen Randall corner a black person, but it was the first time they had seen someone stand this calmly in front of him, along with a dog that had survived more battlefields than any of them could imagine. Randall crossed his arms, then immediately dropped them as if the gesture made him feel too soft. He stepped forward another half step, enough for his shadow to stretch across the ground between the three of them. "I am warning you for the last time, either I confiscate this dog or I put you in the car for a check." Lyria heard every word as clearly as she heard the deep beat of the moment right before things shatter. Baxter stood tight beside her leg, his whole body pulled taut like a bowstring, but still in position because of the command resting on his head. The resolve of the two of them became a mirror that made Randall feel even more compelled to prove his authority was not being challenged. And in the next few seconds, the silence stretched like a breath drawn, before the entire story veered into a direction no one in that neighborhood could have predicted. The air between them had reached a point where even the smallest movement could lift the entire situation out of control. Randall looked at Lyria from head to toe, as if waiting for the exact moment to declare what he wanted. His whole body leaned slightly forward, his shoulders heavy as if a surge of anger were ready to burst out. Lyria kept her back straight, standing exactly where she had chosen. That calmness made Randall feel dismissed, and he wanted to break it by any means. The very next second, he reached out. A hard shove to Lyria's shoulder made her body tilt slightly. Obstructing an officer, Randall said the words dropping sharp and deliberate, as if he were reading aloud the charge he intended to pin on her. It was a line he often used on people who could not fight back, and this time he wanted it to sound even louder. The shoe, paired with the accusation, pushed the situation from tension into actual confrontation. Lyria stepped back exactly half a step. Enough to keep the balance, enough to prevent escalation, but not enough to be seen as bowing. Her movement was calculated steady, like someone who had endured hundreds of moments of being cornered in field operations. Her shoulder stabilized in an instant. Her foot landed on the hot pavement with millimeter precision, a reflex shaped in places where survival mattered far more than any threat Randall could make. Seeing she did not fall, did not stumble, but stood firm instead, made Randall feel he needed to press further. He waited for any sign of an excessive reaction so he could inflate it into a greater excuse. His face tightened, his mouth pressed into a frustrated line, the expression of someone who realized he would need a new pretext if he wanted to escalate. That expression sharpened when he saw his shove had not frightened her the way he expected. While the tension between them stretched like a steel wire, a soft footstep sounded from the end of the street. Evan Brooks was jogging a small water bottle pinned between his fingers. He had been exercising with headphones on, but when he saw how close Randall stood to Lyria, the harsh tone in Randall's voice was loud enough for Evan to stop. He pulled out one earbud and looked more carefully. Randall stood extremely close. Baxter shielded part of her body, and Lyria's face was tense, yet controlled in every breath. Evan stood a few meters away enough to see the cold look in Randall's eyes and every word he hurled at the woman before him. He slowed down, moving behind a mailbox for a clearer view. Curiosity pushed him to step back a few more paces into a safe angle. In that moment, he realized the phone was still in his hand. It was an instinctive reaction, the kind people have when they sense something in front of them could turn serious. He opened the camera, lowered his hand to shoulder height, and hit record. The boy could not predict everything happening, but Randall's expression was enough for Evan to understand that if something bad occurred, no one would believe him unless there was proof. He held the phone steady, adjusting the angle so both Randall and Lyria were fully in frame. Randall was raising his voice, but the distance was still close enough for the camera to capture him clearly. In that same moment, the sunlight hit at the right angle, illuminating Lyria's arm. The fabric at her sleeve had shifted from the shove, revealing a section of ink beneath the skin, sharp, dark, and clear. It was not decorative, but the kind anyone in the military would recognize immediately. A symbol that had appeared in special training sessions requiring absolute discipline and precision military police. Evan did not understand the meaning of that symbol, but his camera captured it perfectly. The image sat right there in the frame, clear enough that later anyone could pause the video and see it instantly. It appeared not because Lyria intended to reveal it, but because Randall's shove had pushed her sleeve up slightly. A small coincidence, yet the detail would become a crucial link in the entire story. While the boy was still recording, Randall stepped closer to Lyria. "You just obstructed an officer, do you understand?" He spoke louder, as if wanting everyone hiding behind their windows to hear he was the one holding authority. His breath seeped out harsh and hot like a growl stuck in his throat, but Lyria kept her gaze locked on him, refusing to avoid it. Baxter stepped sideways, widening the shield of his body in front of her. Randall saw that calmness and grew more enraged. He placed his hand at his hip, his fingers hovering near the spot where he usually kept the equipment he liked to invoke whenever trying to overpower others. Lyria saw it clearly. She glanced past Randall's shoulder, noticing silhouettes behind the windows, then turned back to him. Her eyes held no fear, only the alertness of someone with real combat experience facing a man who might erupt without warning. Evan kept filming his finger, trembling slightly because he sensed the moment he was capturing could be more important than he realized. He watched the scene through the screen like watching a movie, except this time he was standing in the middle of real life. Every movement slowed in his perception the way things often do right before something serious happens. When Randall jerked his head and stepped even closer, Lyria adjusted her stance, her mind already calculating every possibility. Baxter lowered his body slightly as if his muscles were remembering survival drills from the battlefield. None of the three spoke, but the silence itself felt heavier than any threat. And in that silence, the video Evan was recording unintentionally captured the first piece of truth Randall never expected. A small truth sharp enough to pierce through the illusion of authority he had wrapped himself in for so long. The failed shove made Randall tighten like a cord pulled past its limit. He regained his stance and stepped forward another notch to increase the pressure. His eyes were full of domination, his shoulders lowered slightly, and his feet angled the way a man stands when he is preparing to grab someone by force instead of reason. Under the harsh sun of the empty street, he reached out and clamped his hand around Lyria's wrist, gripping hard as if that alone would serve as proof that she had resisted resisted his command. His fingers closed around her wrist tight enough to hurt and strong enough to force her toward the nearby car. His intent was clear: to push her into the wrong he had already decided she had committed. The surprise might have frozen an ordinary person, but Lyria was not an ordinary person. She had lived through situations where a sudden grab was the beginning of something far more dangerous, and her body remembered that long before her mind had time to think. The moment Randall's hand locked around her wrist, an old reflex rose from deep memory. Lyria rotated her wrist at a precise angle, not a forceful move, but an exact one designed to break a grip. At the same time, she pivoted half a step and turned her body, pulling his arm along by inertia. The movement happened in a blink, quick enough that anyone watching from a distance saw only two figures switch positions. Randall jerked from the partial loss of balance, and the hand that had held her wrist was flung into the empty air. His foot stomped the ground to regain balance, but the loss of control forced him to halt briefly. His eyes widened. His breath rose and fell hotter than before, as if her slip from his grasp struck directly at his pride. He growled, his voice far louder than earlier. "A black woman dodging like a soldier. Who do you think you are?" The words burst out fast and loud, meant to assert he was still in control, even though the situation had already begun shifting into a space he could not entirely command. People behind the curtains blinked at the sudden motion Lyria had executed. A few curtains stirred as their owners flinched and hid again, unwilling to let Randall catch them watching. Anyone who had seen his reactions before knew that Randall's humiliation was not something he should realize in the presence of witnesses. Lyria stood about an arm's length from him, her breathing steady, her eyes still sharp. She did not step back, but she did not advance either. The distance between them was just enough to force Randall to choose between stepping forward and stopping. His reaction made it clear he had no desire to stop. The fact that she had slipped free only deepened his need to reclaim the upper hand. Baxter sensed the shift faster than anyone nearby. The dog immediately shifted its weight, its front legs drawing slightly together in a posture trained for bad situations. It placed itself between Lyria and Randall with the instinctive habit of a four-legged soldier that had shielded her from out-of-control danger in places far beyond this quiet street. Its eyes never left Randall. Every one of his movements was tracked. Randall looked down at Baxter with frustration. To him, the dog was not a loyal creature, but an obstacle he needed to remove in order to assert power over the woman behind it. He stepped closer. The heat rising from the pavement mixed with the sweat and cigarette scent on him, thickening the tension between the three of them. When Randall reached toward Lyria again, Baxter reacted before she could signal. It moved slightly sideways, its mouth closed, but its body angled forward. Then, in a moment too quick for anyone to fully register, Baxter leaned toward Randall's leg and grabbed lightly at the hem of his pants. Not a real bite, but a soft pinch enough to pull Randall's attention toward it. It was the kind of warning Baxter had learned in the military, where sometimes a small action was enough to stop a teammate from doing something that would put them in greater danger. Randall jerked his leg back on instinct. He stepped half a pace away, his eyes widening with surprise and surging anger. "You dare touch me!" His voice rose, the frustration tightening in every word. He looked down and saw the pant leg untouched, no tear, no real damage. Yet he stared at Baxter as if the dog had lunged and sunk its teeth into him. The windows along the street shifted again. A few people leaned in to see more clearly after hearing Randall shout. To them, the tension had reached the point where any action could trigger a bad outcome. They watched in a posture half curious, half fearful of being seen by Randall. While Randall poured his anger onto Baxter, Lyria stepped forward half a step, resting her hand gently on the dog's head. Her hand fell exactly on the trained spot meant to keep Baxter calm. The fur along his back quivered slightly, but his eyes no longer focused on Randall's leg. Instead, he looked into Lyria's eyes for confirmation. She did not speak, but the way way her hand rested told him that the warning action was done and he was to wait for the next command. Randall observed the gesture, and the sense that something had slipped beyond his control deepened. His eyes widened with rage, his face flushing as anger built under his skin. He wanted to shout more, to invent a new charge, to do anything that would make the people peeking from their windows believe he still controlled the situation. But the moment he opened his mouth to continue, something greater than his anger appeared, shifting the entire course of events in the next part. That moment became the turning point that pushed the confrontation past a threshold no one in the neighborhood imagined could still be pulled back. The moment Baxter pinched the hem of Randall's pants was like a spark hitting the fuel tank he had been carrying from the beginning. Rage ignited in his eyes as if someone had pulled a pin. Randall stepped back half a pace and shouted, his voice echoing across the street as if he meant to swallow the space between them. The dog attacked me. It tried to bite me. His volume was loud enough for everyone hiding behind their windows to hear clearly. They looked at one another, already tense, because that shout sounded like the trigger for something worse. In the way Randall yelled, people could hear the fabricated panic he was trying to stage, as if he had narrowly escaped a vicious animal instead of a harmless warning nip. The drama in his voice made several onlookers believe Baxter had done something dangerous, even though right there on the pavement, everything remained fully under Lyria's control. Randall looked down at his pant leg, though the fabric was untouched. He bent to inspect it, then lifted his head with anger, searching for more excuses to exaggerate the incident. He did not allow a single second of silence to slip in before shouting again, louder and harsher. "I told you it wanted to attack. You think you can walk it around causing trouble and I will just let it go." His voice cracked, every word striking the air like a blow. The surge of fury made his movements lose control. His right hand swung toward his hip, his fingers hooking onto the strap of the holster where he kept the tool he had used to assert power in countless situations. His eyes changed no longer the glare of a man picking a fight, but the hardened stare Lyria had seen in people prepared to fire without thinking. His shoulders jerked as though he had made a decision in an instant. The tendons along his hand tightened as his palm pressed against the leather of the holster. Lyria saw it immediately. She focused every sense on Randall's movements. A part of her wanted to take a step forward to stop him, but another part forced restraint because any shift from her could be twisted into resistance and drive everything into a dead end. Baxter stood in front of her, his body angled forward. His ears raised, his eyes locked on Randall's hand. Every muscle in him tightened with the reflex of a creature far too familiar with moments where life and death were separated only by a pulled trigger. The residents along the street began making small sounds behind their window glass. Some raised their hands to their mouths. Others stepped back, thinking Randall was about to draw the gun for real. They did not dare open their doors, but panicked eyes and tense silhouettes gathered behind the glass. Shadows shifting across tiled floors inside their homes revealed that everyone understood the situation before them might cross the line of what they had grown used to seeing from Randall. The sunlight on the pavement made everything look brighter, but that brightness did nothing to lighten the air. Lyria saw Randall's hand on the holster and knew she no longer had much time to wait for a reasonable reaction. She knew Baxter was making decisions based on her breathing and subtle cues, so she kept her hand resting lightly on his head. She did not lower her hand too far to avoid suggesting she was preparing to strike, and she did not pull it away to avoid triggering Baxter into a higher level of defense. That balance required a calmness built through years of military training. Randall lifted the flap of the holster slightly and raised his head to look at Lyria. His eyes no longer held only anger, but also the agitation of a man convincing himself that an extreme action was necessary to regain dominance. His shoulders twitched and he repeated himself louder, as if trying to justify drawing his weapon. The dog lunged at me. It attacked me. You know what happens to dangerous animals? Lyria looked at him, her voice lowered just enough to keep her words from sounding like direct defiance. It is warning you. You grabbed my arm first. Those words dropped into the silence between Randall's shouts, a small piece of truth he did not want to hear, and because he did not want to hear it, the line only agitated him more. He narrowed his eyes, his breath pressing into his chest, his hand gripping the holster flap, as if a slight emotional push would be enough to draw the weapon. Baxter moved half a step forward. Lyria felt the shift through her palm. The dog could lunge if Randall pushed too far. She adjusted the pressure of her hand to keep him in place, knowing that if Baxter truly attacked, everything would end in the worst possible way. Across the street, a window swung open. A woman called her husband inside the moment she saw Randall turn toward Lyria again. They feared a bullet might fly before they could close the door. A child around 6 tugged at his mother's shirt wide-eyed, not understanding the situation but sensing the adult's fear. Randall still did not release the holster. The slow passing seconds made everyone feel as if they were watching a scene stretched tight as a blade. Lyria steadied her breathing, watching every millimeter of Randall's hand. Baxter remained planted, eyes locked on him. No one spoke, but the street felt suspended between sky and ground. No one could guess what Randall would do next. He jerked his head, looking at Lyria like a man approaching a point he might not be able to return from. Fear, shallow breath from the onlookers, the alert tension in Baxter's eyes, the heat rising from the pavement, the hum of insects along the grass all blended into a suffocating atmosphere. And in that chaotic moment, Randall made a move the neighborhood would remember for years. A move that pushed everything toward a new boundary in the next part. Randall stood facing Lyria with his hand on the holster. He was breathing hard, someone provoked to the point of no longer knowing what was real and what was his own invention. His eyes darted between Lyria and Baxter, the kind of gaze belonging to a man controlled by anger rather than someone handling an actual situation. Even those peeking through the windows held their breath as if any sound might push him into exploding. Baxter stood shield-like in front of Lyria, his large frame pressed low to the pavement, his eyes fixed on Randall. His posture showed tension running through every tendon. Lyria kept one hand on his back to hold him at a level just short of lunging. Randall watched that scene and his reactions grew harsher. He tilted his head up and then snapped it down quickly as if trapped inside the fury he himself had created. In the moment when the silence of all the houses compressed into something like a layer of pressurized heat, Randall yanked the flap of the holster hard. His finger touched the cold metal, and instead of pausing to reconsider, he made a decision like a man who had fully lost control. Boom! The gunshot tore through the midday air, sharp and violent. The sound cracked so suddenly that most of the neighborhood jolted. A few hands flew to mouths. A child in a nearby house burst into tears. A man in the house to the right fell backward into his chair from shock. But all of those reactions came only after the bullet had already left the barrel and found its target. Baxter was pushed back half a step. His body shuddered, then collapsed right in front of Lyria. A heavy, cold silence spread across the pavement like a thin sheet of ice settling over a summer street. No one dared breathe deeply. Lyria dropped to her knees by reflex, both hands catching Baxter, the way someone catches a friend slipping out of their grasp in a moment they never wanted to relive again. Baxter's chest rose fast, then slowed sharply, his breath breaking like wind cut short at a cliff's edge. The fur along his chest darkened as blood soaked through, turning red and spreading across the gray strands worn from too many missions. His body trembled, and his eyes flicked up toward Lyria, as if telling her he was still there, even as strength drained from him. Lyria pressed her hand against the wound, her voice cracking slightly as she called his name. Baxter, look at me. Her voice was low breaking, but it held the familiar steadiness that had kept him alive through attacks and places much farther from here. Now, on a quiet American street, that same voice echoed as a sound pulled straight from a battlefield. Baxter tried to lift his head, but it moved only a fraction. The pain in Lyria's eyes shifted into something else. It was no longer the despair of someone losing a teammate, but the cold resolve of someone who refused to let this tragedy become meaningless. She pulled Baxter's head gently into her arms, her breath pressed into her chest, as if trying to keep the last bit of life from slipping away. Her whole body shook once, just once, before she forced every surge of emotion down into a depth only soldiers ever learned to reach. Evan stood a few meters away, the phone in his hand shaken violently. After the gunshot, he shouted as if he could no longer hold himself together. "I recorded it. I got everything. She did nothing." His voice cut through the chaos like a needle through thick fabric. The video on his phone was still running, the frame trembling but capturing every detail of Randall drawing his gun, firing, and Baxter collapsing. Randall snapped his head toward Evan. His eyes were filled with shock and agitation, as if he had never expected anyone to hold such clear evidence. "Turn that off," he yelled, but his voice had lost the certainty it carried moments earlier. It was no longer the command of a man abusing authority, but the shout of someone feeling the ground slipping beneath him. Evan stepped back, once his hand gripping the phone like it was the only thing that could protect him and the truth. He looked at Lyria, then at Randall, pale-faced yet refusing to run. That small act made Randall's expression twitch as though he had been yanked out of his frenzy and forced to recognize that everything had gone beyond his control. Meanwhile, Lyria leaned closer to Baxter. The dog struggled for breath, yet his eyes still searched for her. She placed a hand on his head the way she had done countless times before, though this time her fingers trembled with the pain of losing him. She drew in a deep breath, let it out slowly, and forced her voice not to break into sobs. She bent near Baxter's head and whispered something only two longtime companions could understand. A farewell as quiet as the closing of a memory she would carry for the rest of her life. When Lyria stood, the people behind the windows all stepped back, even though their doors remained shut. Her face was no longer that of an ordinary citizen standing before an abusive officer. She rose with a dangerous calm that Randall could not decipher. Her eyes were red but dry, her mouth slightly parted, as if she were about to say something he would never expect. She took exactly one step forward. Sunlight fell across the faded uniform marked by battlefield dust. The military police tattoo on her arm slipped into view. Her gaze fixed on Randall, not angry, not grieving, but sharp, like a steel door locking shut in front of a foolish intruder. Her voice came out clear, steady, unfaltering, cold as metal. "You just shot the dog of a Navy SEAL." The line dropped onto the quiet street like a heavy stone plunging into water. Randall froze where he stood. No shouting, no accusations he could fling at the woman before him. Every breath in him stalled in that instant. His face drained of color, his eyes blinked once, and he stood unmoving as a man struck directly in the center of his pride. The people inside their homes heard the words, and a few curtains opened wider, some residents even lifting their hands to their foreheads in shock. Evan's mouth fell open as he stood frozen, the phone still recording. Randall could not speak. His face drained of color, his hand twitching like someone who had lost his sense of direction. The only thing he felt now was the truth crashing down on him like a hammer, a truth he knew would crush him in a way no lie he invented could protect him from. It was the moment the entire street fell still, and Randall, the man who believed he held the power of life and death, finally realized he had pushed himself to a cliff with no way back. After the gunshot and Lyria's statement, the street sank into an uncanny silence. Randall stood there like a shattered statue, and the residents hiding behind their windows watched with fear and shock woven together. Evan still held his phone, his hand trembling. He looked from the screen to Baxter, lying motionless, and then to Lyria's face, still sharp and controlled. The truth was so unmistakable that the boy inhaled deeply, as if stepping into a decision far bigger than anything he had ever done before. Evan pressed stop, his palm damp with sweat. He watched a few seconds of the video and saw the truth displayed plainly as daylight. Randall fired, Baxter fell, and Lyria never attacked. There was no ambiguity in any frame. It was enough to protect her and enough to force consequences onto Randall. He sent the clip to the neighborhood group chat, the one used by hundreds of residents to report broken pavement, lost items, or stray cats. Never had that group witnessed anything as heavy as the video Evan had just posted. Inside the houses, phones began vibrating non-stop. A few windows glowed with reflected screens. The first messages appeared full of shock and questions. Someone wrote, "Is this real?" Another added, "Randall just shot a dog," and someone else typed, "She is wearing a uniform," followed by a cascade of replies pouring in. Evan had not even looked away from his screen when a new message popped up beneath the clip. The account belonged to Mr. Lewis, the older man at the end of the street, a former Army serviceman. His reply was short but stopped everyone cold. "Look closely at her left arm, that is a military police insignia." The moment he sent it, someone enlarged one frame of the video. It showed Lyria leaning over Baxter, her sleeve pushed up to reveal the tattoo. The lines were clear enough that anyone who had served even briefly could recognize them. It was a symbol often given to those who had completed training in oversight battlefield support or specialized access units. Mr. Lewis sent another message almost immediately. "This is not a civilian tattoo. It is the military police. If it is real, this is bigger than a neighborhood incident." His words spread like sparks hitting smoldering coals. In less than a minute, the clip began circulating through a nearby veterans group that several residents belonged to. Evan watched the notifications roll in like a wave running through the community. Those who had served started offering assessments. They analyzed the tattoo, Lyria's posture facing Randall, and Baxter's instincts. One commented, "That dog is clearly a combat K9, look at its stance." Another added, "She's too calm. That kind of calm usually comes from special operations." Each new comment fueled the rising anger of everyone watching. No one sat still after seeing an officer insulted and then witnessing a combat dog fall in a way no one could accept. The tone of the messages shifted. Clear abuse of power. She maintained control exceptionally well. That cop lost his mind, and anyone can see the dog was warning, not attacking. The clip spread into larger military groups, accounts belonging to Marines, Air Force personnel, paratroopers, and even former Special Operations members reacted. They said the video needed to be reviewed at a higher level. Someone wrote, "If she really is a Navy SEAL, this is bigger than the neighborhood realizes." Another comment, "I recognize that pivot. That is a military police escape maneuver." Each line was another wave dragging Randall deeper, far outside his awareness. In a very short time, the clip spread beyond the local residents. A veterans network reposted it with the sharper title, "Female Officers Combat K9 Shot by Police." Hundreds of shares appeared. People discussed non-stop. Some said they had raised K9s, served overseas, or witnessed dogs saving teammates' lives. Baxter's death in front of his handler felt like a blow to their memories. Meanwhile, messages in the neighborhood group continued pouring in. One resident said, "I heard the gunshot from inside." Another wrote, "She did not attack. I saw it from my window." And an older woman added, "Randall did something similar to my boy once. Thank God it did not end in a gunshot." Old stories that the residents had buried began resurfacing with the video. The reaction hit its peak when a Special Operations veteran joined the conversation. He wrote, "If she truly is a Navy SEAL, Randall firing on her K9 will be treated like shooting one of her teammates on the battlefield." His words carried not only technical accuracy, but the understanding of someone who had lived and fought beside working dogs. The comments that followed grew sharper. A Special Operations officer humiliated a K9, killed in the street because of abuse of power. If the military sees this, he is finished. Each line pushed the community's outrage beyond anything Randall could imagine. All the while, Evan stared at his screen, watching share notifications pop up like waves crashing from shore to land. He realized he had triggered something far larger than he expected. He looked at Lyria, still kneeling beside Baxter, with her hand on his blood-soaked fur, and understood that in only a few minutes nothing would remain in Randall's control anymore. Residents in the area began sharing small clipped segments taken from Evan's video. Some circled the military police tattoo, others marked Randall's hand pulling the weapon, and others cut out the moment Lyria stood, her face cold as steel, speaking the line that sent chills through anyone who watched. All of it merged into a single violent storm. A storm that had only just formed and was already racing toward the military community, not with shouting, but with evidence sharp as steel. And at the end of the street, Randall still stood frozen, his face pale, completely unaware that the state's entire military community had now heard the gunshot he fired and was already furious on behalf of the woman he had tried to crush. The spread of the video happened faster than anyone in the neighborhood imagined, as comments from veteran special operations members and military groups poured in. The information reached an agency no one expected to become involved in an incident inside a quiet residential street. The NCIS Response Center received an unusual alert from its own internal monitoring system. One of the flagged keywords was Navy SEAL, accompanied by the short video shaken military forums. Inside the watchroom, NCIS officers replayed the video several times, pausing on the clear MP tattoo on Lyria's arm. Under the sunlight in the footage, they immediately recognized that the woman shown was not a civilian wearing a uniform. The ink, her posture, her control brake reflex, everything indicated she belonged to a special operations branch with deep access to military police units. One NCIS officer rose, looked at the others, and spoke firmly. "We need to get there immediately." No special operations officer gets insulted and loses a combat K-9 without representation. His voice was not loud, but it carried the certainty of someone who understood the severity of the situation. The others exchanged glances, then moved into action at once. An NCIS team deployed in record time. A black SUV left the base at a pace steady enough to avoid attention, but carrying the weight of a force trained for situations far beyond the reach of local police. Everyone inside the vehicle rewatched the video, memorizing positions, postures, and each of Randall's movements. They saw clearly this was the kind of abuse that led to tragedies no service member would ever forgive. When the SUV turned into the street where Randall stood, residents watching through their windows nearly pressed their faces to the glass. They did not know what was about to happen, but the arrival of NCIS felt like the appearance of a force from another world, one where discipline, honor, and justice outweighed personal impulses. The vehicle stopped in the middle of the street. 4 officers stepped out with the calm professionalism of people who had handled countless serious incidents before. Randall stood several steps away, still pale after hearing Lyria's statement. When he saw the NCIS vehicle, he jolted visibly, as if realizing these were not subordinates, not neighbors, and not people he could intimidate. These were from a force he had no authority over. An NCIS officer walked straight toward Lyria, his eyes scanning from her dusted uniform to the MP tattoo still visible on her arm. He stopped and dipped his head slightly, a gesture of respect between service members. "Major Dawson," he said, his voice steady and low, "we have seen the video. We are here to protect you and investigate the entire incident." Lyria stood still for a moment. She looked at them with eyes that held both gratitude and the sharp ache of knowing Baxter lay behind her. Another NCIS officer stepped forward to quickly assess the dog's condition. He knelt, checked the last faint signs of life, then looked up with the sorrowful expression of someone who had watched teammates fall before. "Combat Day 9, he murmured. "We will document everything and bring him back with full honors. Meanwhile, Randall realized attention had shifted toward him. He stepped back like a man caught doing something unforgivable in front of people he could not intimidate with his usual shouting. An NCIS officer turned to him, his gaze cold and firm. "You are Officer Randall Hale," he said, not as a question but as confirmation. Randall swallowed and nodded quickly. "You are not leaving this area," the officer continued. "Not until we gather all information and transfer the case to the appropriate authorities." His tone was so decisive that Randall nearly froze. He tried to speak, maybe to justify himself, maybe to blame Baxter, but the eyes of the entire NCIS team stopped him. Their expression made it clear he was facing not local officers, but people who held authority far above his reach, a place where excuses and blind anger had no value. One NCIS officer stared directly at Randall and delivered the final line that silenced the entire street. "You discharged your weapon at a combat K-9 protecting a special operations officer. We need a full account of your actions, from the moment you approached her to the moment you pulled the trigger." Randall lifted a hand but dropped it immediately. Sweat rolled down his forehead in heavy drops. He stepped back another half pace as a man pushed into a corner. Lyria no longer looked at him. Her eyes remained on Baxter as she pressed down the surge of emotion. The NCIS team formed a perimeter, partly protecting her, partly containing Randall, and partly analyzing the scene. The residents behind their windows watched with a mix of relief and disbelief. Some exhaled quietly, others placed their hands on their chests. They had seen Randall for years, and never had they witnessed him stop like this. A few who once endured his shouting now saw him standing still, stripped of the authority he had relied on. An NCIS officer turned to Evan. "You recorded the video?" he asked, his voice gentler than when he addressed Randall. Evan nodded and offered the phone with both hands. "I recorded everything. No cuts." The officer took it and nodded slightly, signaling that this footage would become crucial evidence. The scene shifted from chaos to order the moment NCIS arrived. They worked quickly, decisively, leaving Randall no room to interrupt. Another vehicle was called to transport Baxter from the scene with the honor due to a combat K-9. Lyria stood beside it, watching the stretcher draped in cloth being moved, her eyes carrying emotions both restrained and burning. And at that moment, Randall understood this was no longer a street-side argument. He had struck at a force he had no right to challenge. Whatever excuses he wanted to offer, every piece of evidence had been recorded, and every eye in the military community was now fixed on this small neighborhood. The street remained silent, but the curtain over the truth had been pulled back completely, and Randall knew that from this second on he no longer stood on the stronger side. After Randall was held in place on the street, the first urgent report was sent to the local police headquarters. News of an officer accused of abuse of power, backed by a viral video, spread so quickly that the Internal Affairs Unit had to open a case that same afternoon. They could not ignore it when multiple military groups and NCIS were referencing the incident, especially with the keyword Navy SEAL appearing in the report. A department head opened the file, sighed at the long list of complaints Randall had accumulated over the years, then wrote in the opening section, "Potential intentional abuse of authority," while a team of officers reviewed Randall's history. NCIS conducted its own investigation inside a temporary room of a nearby house. Lyria sat on a wooden chair, hands gripping the edge of her pants, her face tense but unbroken. The loss of Baxter remained clear in her eyes, yet she kept her breathing steady as an NCIS officer placed a file on the table and asked, with respect, "Major Dawson, we need your testimony to complete the report for command." Lyria recounted each step, taking Baxter to the clinic, stopping to help the injured boy, Randall's approach, and the words he hurled at her. She kept her account as honest as she had written mission reports notes throughout her years of service. The NCIS officers recorded everything, their expressions growing more severe as they realized the abuse was not an accident, but a chain of actions driven by bias. One NCIS officer asked her about Baxter's warning behavior. Lyria explained it was a natural reflex of a combat K9, not an act of aggression. The statement made the recorder pause for a moment, knowing well the difference between a warning gesture and an actual bite. The precision in Lyria's testimony reinforced what they had already seen in the video. Outside, several residents gathered as NCIS moved through the neighborhood to interview witnesses. Mrs. Conway stood at her porch holding an old phone. She waited until an NCIS officer stepped into the yard, then raised her hand. "I have doorbell footage," she said quietly but firmly. It caught to the moment Randall yelled at her before the boy started recording. The officer stepped closer and accepted the phone. He opened the video, the angle distant but clear enough to show Randall initiating hostility from the start. He rewound a few seconds, confirming there was no threatening move from Lyria before Baxter stepped forward. He saved the footage to the NCIS equipment and nodded to Mrs. Conway. "Thank you. This video is important." Mrs. Conway exhaled, worry evident in her voice. "I have seen him give people trouble all year. This time he went too far." The NCIS officers nearby heard her. None responded, but all understood this was not an isolated incident. An internal affairs case had begun, a military case was underway, and both were leading toward the same conclusion. Inside the temporary investigation room, Lyria's statement was nearly complete. An NCIS officer closed the file and spoke slowly. "With what you have provided, along with Evan's video and Mrs. Conway's recording, the entire situation shows that Randall deliberately pushed the incident to a dangerous level." His eyes lifted, locking onto Lyria, as if to affirm that this truth could not be covered by any excuse Randall might offer. Another officer stepped into the room and placed a tablet on the table. "We reviewed the circulating footage. The veteran groups all concluded Baxter's response was a proper warning. No one sees any sign of aggression." He turned the screen to a long comment from a former K9 handler who had served in special operations. Lyria read it in silence, her hand tightening slightly. Every word in the comment was confirmation from people who understood Baxter's worth better than anyone else. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs continued strengthening their file. They reviewed every prior complaint against Randall, many involving harassment, intimidation, and several notes stating insufficient evidence for disciplinary action. This time, the difference was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming. Evan's video, the doorbell recording the residents' statements, and the military's assessments all aligned perfectly. An internal affairs investigator sat before a computer, paused at the frame where Randall drew his weapon, tilted his head, and said to a colleague, "This is what complete loss of control looks like. And if he charged in even after knowing she was an officer, that is intentional misconduct." During the same period, NCIS and Internal Affairs coordinated to avoid overlapping procedures. A joint assessment was drafted with the first line summarizing Randall's conduct: evidence of abuse of authority, reckless endangerment, and improper discharge of a firearm. The sentence was read twice, each repetition thickening the air. No one doubted anything anymore. The case was far too clear to cover up and far too serious to lessen. Evan was brought in to provide information. He stood before the table, shaken slightly, but speaking with precise clarity. He described the moment he began recording and confirmed that Lyria made no aggressive move at any point. Once that statement was officially entered into the file, an NCIS officer nodded, recognizing it as the final critical piece. All evidence combined like heavy stones dropping onto Randall. The truth could no longer be bent. Too many witnesses, too many recordings. And most importantly, the person he targeted was a Navy SEAL officer marked with a military police insignia who had just lost a combat K9 before her eyes. An NCIS officer rose, looked out the window where Randall was being held, and spoke spoke in a lowered voice. "This will not stay at the local level. A special operations officer was insulted and put in danger a combat K-9 shot, and the entire military community has seen the footage. In that room, everyone understood the investigation already had its direction, and every direction led to one unchangeable conclusion: Randall had abused his authority deliberately, and that wrongdoing would follow him all the way to the court's verdict." As the investigation from both sides began, murmurs started rising through the neighborhood. For the first time in many years, the residents felt safe enough to talk about Randall. They stood on their porches, glancing at the NCIS team, collecting evidence. Then, at the spot where Randall was being held, and the long-standing silence in the neighborhood seemed to crack at the same pace the video was spreading. A middle-aged man leaned on his doorframe and asked the person beside him with a frustrated tone, "He threatened my kid on the way to school, just because the boy rode his bike faster than he liked." The story sounded long overdue, and the reactions from nearby houses showed it was not unfamiliar to them. A woman in her 40s cutting her voice dropping. "He once pointed a gun at me right at my doorstep, just because I asked him not to block my driveway." She spoke while staring at Randall under supervision. Her words made several others nod, some biting their lips as if recalling something they had tried hard to forget. With every person who spoke, the sense of long-buried pressure in the neighborhood grew heavier. An elderly man shook his head, speaking softer, but with bitterness. "He's been doing this for years." But everyone was afraid to say anything. Behind him, a young man leaned against his railing, gripping his phone tightly. "He stopped me once and said my face looked suspicious. Luckily, someone walked by." Story followed story. Like pieces falling out of a box, everyone had tried to keep shut. All of it began with a single gunshot, then spread in every direction, pulling out memories buried under years of fear. Inside the local police station, internal affairs officers began reopening old reports tied to Randall. A stack of yellow folders landed on the table. The pages inside were worn, annotated by the handwriting of various officers who had handled them. One report from 4 years earlier was marked in red "Threatened Citizen" during traffic check. Another noted used inappropriate language toward an Asian resident. Many carried comments like insufficient evidence for disciplinary action, no witnesses, difficult to verify. What struck the internal affairs team most was the repeated pattern of behavior. An officer opened 3 consecutive files and placed them side by side. Same profile, same way of provoking, same escalation pattern, he said, his expression hardening. Reading the reports no longer felt like reviewing information, but like staring at the surface of a massive iceberg everyone had pretended was small. Another file was pulled from a drawer, wrapped in a stiff cover, and marked as closed. Inside was a complaint from a young man who had accused Randall of detaining him without cause. But the file had been closed faster than standard procedure with no clear explanation. The team reopened it and immediately found irregularities. A young internal affairs officer pointed to the signature block. This file was closed for lack of evidence. But now we have video, we have witnesses, people are speaking up. At the same time, NCIS also began receiving waves of messages from people who had encountered Randall in different situations. They did not send them directly to the local police out of fear of being ignored, but they sent them to NCIS with the hope that a military authority would acknowledge them. One man who had served in the reserves wrote that Randall had stopped him twice in the same week, asked rude questions, and deliberately kept him standing under the sun far too long. A woman who worked at a nearby shop wrote that Randall once drove her back inside the store simply because she looked at him for too long. Those stories were not major crimes on their own, but when placed together they formed a long trail of corruption. Each account was a part of Randall that few had dared to speak aloud before. Now, with NCIS present and pressure from the military community mounting, every piece began to fall into place. On social media, countless posts continued spreading. Some people shared that he had threatened them with the words, "I am the law in this neighborhood." An older man wrote, "He yelled at me in front of my grandchild. I did not dare talk back because I was afraid he would do something reckless." Those comments were added to hundreds of shares under Evans' clip. A few hours later, a reporter from the local news station released a brief early report. The segment was short, but it included one line that made readers pause for several seconds. Several previous files involving Officer Randall Hale are being re-examined due to signs of improper handling. That sentence was reposted across multiple pages, prompting a new wave of comments. So this was not something new. Pieces of Randall's past surfaced like old sounds being rewound each rewind, a strike that shattered the image he had tried to build. The persona of the powerful officer no longer frightened people. Now it was a mask falling in the middle of the street, exposing the cracked surface beneath. An internal affairs officer nodded as he reviewed the reopened files and said to a colleague, "Within 24 hours he became a symbol of corruption." No one needed further explanation. They all understood that there was no exaggeration. A man who had abused his position for years, relying on residents' fear, was now exposed under the scrutiny of the military community and the very people who once stayed silent. Randall, standing within the containment circle, lifted his eyes toward the neighborhood he had always considered his own backyard. But instead of obedient looks or lowered eyes avoiding confrontation, he saw doors cracked open with firm, unflinching gazes behind them. The silence now meant something different. It was no longer the silence of endurance, but the silence forcing him to face everything he had sown. When the official investigation entered its first day, NCIS and the internal affairs team of the police department sat together to cross-check the evidence. A large table was placed in the center of the temporary meeting room, covered with documents, recording devices, and duplicate video files. The air in the room was thick with concentration. Everyone understood that the decisions made now would determine the direction of the entire case, and the evidence lay right in front of them, clear as midday light. First, an NCIS officer opened the doorbell footage from Mrs. Conway's house. The screen displayed a wide angle, capturing the entire front yard and the stretch of road where Randall approached Lyria. The image was distant, but clear enough to show Baxter standing right beside her leg in a steady posture, head slightly tilted, showing no forward movement at all. The officer replayed that segment a second time and paused at the moment Randall stepped forward. From that angle, everyone could see Baxter standing still like a small stone, looking tired after the clinic visit, yet unwaveringly guarding his place at his handler's side. An internal affairs officer braced both hands on the table and spoke plainly. "Just from this, it is clear the dog created no threat whatsoever." He wrote a short sentence into the report. Baxter maintained position, no signs of aggression. That line erased every argument Randall was attempting to cling to. After that, NCIS moved to Evans' video, the clip capturing everything from Randall shoving Lyria's shoulder to the moment the gun fired. In the meeting room, no one spoke as Randall's shouting came through the computer speakers. The sound was chaotic, but every word was clear. Nothing in the footage was obstructed, and every motion showed plainly under the sunlight. When Randall seized Lyria's wrist and tried to force her against the car, an older officer frowned. Initiated physical aggression. Not a proper engagement protocol, he wrote down. When the footage reached the moment Baxter tugged lightly at the pant leg, the video showed with absolute clarity that there was no strong pull. It was merely a warning nip from a combat K9, the kind of signal any trained handler would recognize instantly. As they analyzed that section, an NCIS officer added another line to the report. Baxter's response was instinctive warning behavior, not an attack. The video continued to the point where Randall drew his weapon. In the frame, his action was too quick and left no pause for assessment. No one saw any dangerous sign from either Lyria or Baxter at that moment. The internal affairs officer paused the footage at the instant Randall pulled the trigger and spoke with a flat voice. "There is no justification," he fired, while the situation had not escalated to warrant force. Lyria was also present in the room. She did not speak, only stood still, watching the screen, her eyes fixed on the moment Baxter was shot and fell. An NCIS officer glanced in her direction but refrained from interrupting, respecting the way she held her grief down. They knew every second of footage repeated a wound for her, yet she remained there like a soldier, standing witness for the fallen partner she had lost. After watching Evan's video, the internal affairs officer concluded with a short but forceful sentence. Randall initiated the confrontation and used force beyond necessity. That line was underlined heavily in the file. When both videos had been analyzed, an NCIS officer opened a screenshot taken from the footage, the frame showing the military police tattoo on Lyria's arm. He enlarged it until every line of ink appeared clearly. The tattoo was not decorative, but an emblem of the military police issued only to those who had completed specialized training, held clearance for restricted military zones, and participated in classified assignments. The NCIS officer said, "This marking alone is enough to confirm she is an actual service member. It aligns with her statement and the reflexes we saw in the video." No one in the room disagreed. They had seen the way Lyria broke free from the grab, the way she held her position, the way she shielded Baxter, even as everything was falling apart. None of that could be fake. An internal affairs officer flipped through more paperwork. So Randall insulted a special operations officer while she was in uniform, and he shot and killed a combat K-9. The sentence written into the report landed like a hammer striking heavy wood. Everyone in the room understood this was no longer a simple assault case in a residential neighborhood. It had become an incident involving direct conflict between law enforcement and the military. The meeting room sank into silence for a long moment. Each person around the table was comparing Randall's actions to the severity of the consequences. The abuse of authority could not be concealed when there were clear recordings from 3 separate angles, consistent statements from residents, and NCIS documentation lining up point for point. One NCIS officer finally spoke, his voice slow but solid. "There is no room for denial. All evidence points directly to Randall Hale as the aggressor who discharged his weapon outside of protocol." He closed the file, the sound firm as the truth singing off every escape route available to Randall. Out in the hallway, several officers walking past glanced toward the meeting room with troubled eyes. News that Randall was about to face something far beyond internal discipline had already circulated through the station. The atmosphere, once routine, had grown heavy. Randall was no longer a colleague, but an emblem of corruption exposed in full daylight. Outside the house, the NCIS had converted into a workspace, and residents gathered at a distance to watch. Many already knew Randall had walked himself into a dead end. They did not need new footage to believe it, but the hard evidence had brought the truth into view in a way no one could dispute. Lyria stepped out of the meeting room and stood on the porch for a few seconds. The breeze brushed her face lightly like the last breath of Baxter still lingering on her palm. She knew the investigation had reached the stage where the truth stood with her and with the fallen partner she had lost. She looked up at the sun-hazed sky, a weight in her chest that felt both painful and relieving. As for Randall, now removed from all duties, he sat motionless in the monitoring room, unaware that every piece of evidence outside had already closed the final door meant for him. That afternoon, Randall was placed in the temporary interrogation room of the local police department. The air inside felt sticky if every wall were watching him. Fear, mixed with anger, made him lean forward and then fall back again, grinding his teeth like someone barely holding himself together. When the 2 investigators stepped in, Randall immediately straightened his eyes, flaring with the same defiance he always carried. He did not wait for them to speak. He erupted as if unloading the last of his fury. "I acted in self-defense." Randall spat out each word sharp and hurried. "That dog was aggressive, and she resisted an officer." He spoke with his hand clamped to the edge of the table, as if trying to hold on to whatever power he still believed he had. His words hit the room with tension, as though he hoped that saying them loudly enough would force the truth to bend his way. One investigator flipped a page in a thick stack of documents and looked at Randall with a calm, level stare. "You are saying the dog was aggressive?" he asked, voice steady as still water. Randall nodded hard, pushing forward again. "I warned them. It moved on me. I had to fire." The other investigator picked up a tablet, tapped once, and played the video from Mrs. Conway's doorbell camera. The interrogation room shifted into an odd silence as the footage showed Baxter standing directly beside Lyria, legs set, head lightly tilted. No lunge, no growl, no sign of an attacking animal. When Randall's voice echoed faintly from the yard in the recording, the investigator lowered his eyes to the notes and said in a low tone, "In this video, Baxter is standing still." Randall blinked several times, his throat tightening. He looked away, forcing his voice to stay hard enough to keep some sense of control. That was the beginning, not when it came at me. He clung to the sentence like someone gripping a cliff edge. The investigator switched videos. This time it was Evan's recording. The full scene from the moment Randall shoved Lyria's shoulder to the moment Baxter took a light hold of his pant leg appeared clearly. The investigator slowed the clip at the instant Baxter touched the fabric and froze the frame. "This is a warning touch. Not enough force to pull, not enough to injure." He looked straight at Randall. "You said it charged. The video says otherwise." Randall began to see his reflection in the footage, a version of himself he had never imagined facing. But instead of going quiet, he clung to the last thing left, stubborn denial. "Cameras miss angles. You do not understand. It threatened me." He spoke as if trying to shove the entire room backward. The investigator continued. "We have statements from 8 witnesses plus the doorbell video and Evans footage. All of them match." He opened a recorded statement from Mrs. Conway. Her voice rose clearly from the speaker. The dog stood in front of her to protect her, but it did not bite. It was so tired anyone could see that. Randall turned his face away, his eyes reddening with anger mixed with helplessness. A vein on his temple twitched nonstop as if it were about to burst. "This whole neighborhood hates me, so they pin everything on me," he said, his voice more frustrated than confident. "They always do." The investigator stopped writing and tilted his head. "You are saying the entire group of residents, the boy who filmed you, the person who provided the doorbell footage, and NCIS, all fabricated a coordinated story to destroy you?" The question struck with a stern weight that made Randall freeze for a few seconds. He knew he could not answer in the same way he used to shout down people in the neighborhood, but he still tried to cling to the old tactic, the one he relied on for years, overwhelmed with volume. "I know what I saw." He slammed his hand on the table, but the impact did not echo the way he wanted. It sounded dull, short, as if the truth itself had swallowed his force. The investigator did not react to the outburst. He opened another file, this one containing documentation of the military police tattoo on Lyria's arm. He turned the screen toward Randall. "Do you know this symbol?" Randall tried to keep a cold expression, but his eyes flickered. The investigator continued. "It is the marking of the military police. We have confirmed it. Ms. Dawson is a real officer, and her reflexes in the video align completely with that." Randall swallowed hard. He had nothing left to twist the conversation in his favor. But because he refused to admit wrongdoing, he grabbed onto a flimsy excuse. "I did not know she was military." The investigator answered immediately, not giving him room to build the next sentence. "The law requires you to assess the situation, not judge by skin color or bias. You drew your weapon before any danger existed." He paused for a moment, then concluded, "Your statement contradicts every piece of recorded evidence." Randall shifted in his chair like someone being dragged away from the last thing he was clinging to. The excuses he had relied on no longer carried weight. The investigator flipped through each page of the report, pointing out every inconsistency, every detail that did not match the videos. Randall stared at them as if looking at a list of charges being carved in stone. In that moment, he understood everything had slipped far beyond his control. The self-defense claim he tried to build was too fragile against the layers of truth being revealed. But instead of accepting it, he circled back in desperation. "They do not understand the pressure I am under," he muttered almost to himself. The investigator gathered the files and stood. "Randall Hale, you have just delivered a series of contradictory statements. The report will be sent to the department and the court with all accompanying evidence." Randall sat still for a few seconds, his hands trembling with anger more than fear. But no one saw that anger as authority anymore. It was nothing but the hollow echo of a man pushing himself deeper into a dead end. In the hallway, several officers glanced toward the interrogation room with cold expressions. Any respect once held for a fellow officer was gone, replaced with detached disdain that Randall felt like a tightness in his chest. He was led out of the room, his steps heavy. The arrogance that used to cloak him on the street had disappeared like sand pulled away by a wave. Each excuse he had shouted earlier replayed in his head, sounding like delayed echoes from a deep hole he had dug himself. After the interrogation, the investigators spent many hours cross-checking every statement and piece of evidence. The meeting room at the police department stayed lit, files opened, closed, and rearranged into order. When the internal affairs team wrote the final line of their conclusion, no one argued because the truth was undeniable. They formally charged Randall Hale with 3 offenses: abuse of authority, filing an improper procedural report, and unlawful use of force, resulting in serious consequences. The 3 lines were printed into the report like 3 cuts slicing through the last layer of defense he had left. An investigator tapped the file in front of him and spoke quietly to a colleague. "This case is no longer confined to internal affairs. There is a saying that fire cannot be hidden in paper. The video is everywhere now." The other man nodded, his eyes carrying the fatigue of someone who had seen many bad cases, but rarely one that peeled back so many layers at once. The charges were read aloud in a closed meeting, and everyone present understood there was no way to soften or revise them. Immediately after, NCIS sent its own conclusion. In it, they emphasized that the incident had directly damaged the honor of the Navy, especially the Special Operations community. One NCIS officer stated before the joint report that a Special Operations officer being disrespected on a public street while in uniform is an act that violates every value the military stands for. That statement was quoted verbatim in the combined summary sent to the local police department. The atmosphere in the room shifted as soon as the line was read. It carried the weight of thousands of service members, a voice law enforcement could not ignore. News of the investigation's conclusions began leaking through media channels. The first posts appeared on social networks quoting internal sources. Randall Hale charged with abuse of authority, improper procedural report, unlawful use of force. The headlines spread one after another, igniting a public outcry stronger than anything before. Comments multiplied at a staggering rate. Many expressed outrage over a combat K-9 killed in the middle of the street, and others over a special operations officer being insulted in broad daylight. The reactions merged into a collective surge of anger. One person wrote, "A combat dog that spent its life saving people died at the hands of a man who abused his power." Another commented, "If they cover this up, the public will lose all trust." Below, a familiar account from the veterans community posted a clear statement without noisy anger, but with unmistakable authority. "If the local police do not handle this properly, the military will speak for itself." Those lines spread, placing immense pressure on the local police department. The media began calling repeatedly for an official response. One afternoon, the department's spokesperson stood before the cameras and was hit with rapid-fire questions. Why was Randall Hale still on duty before this? How many past complaints were ignored? Was there any cover-up? Each question struck like a hammer against a door already starting to give way. Public pressure demanded more decisive action. In major forums, numerous posts called for peaceful demonstrations to demand accountability for Randall. Military groups shared those posts as well, affirming they would follow the case closely and not allow it to fade. People spoke of Lyria in spreading discussions, viewing her as a symbol of composure and strength in the face of injustice. Tension inside the police department peaked as many younger officers began worrying about the unit's credibility. An internal meeting was held and the division chief spoke bluntly. If we don't handle this transparently, the consequences will be beyond our control. The reputation of the entire force is on the table. No one in the room objected. Even those who once stood behind Randall realized there was no way to defend him when the video was too clear and when public anger had surpassed the safety threshold. A veteran officer rose and sighed. I used to think he was just hot-tempered, but now it's obvious. He went far past the line. That sentence made the entire room fall silent. Some pressed their lips together, others looked down at the table. The silence felt like an admission that Randall had dragged the entire department into a difficult position. Official reports were signed and prepared to be sent to the district attorney's office. The files were thick, stacked into a bundle heavy enough to shift the career of anyone involved. Every word in the conclusion was written with utmost caution, yet the severity of the conduct remained. Intentional abuse of authority, false reporting, violent action contrary to protocol, each item closing another lock on Randall's last remaining door. That same day, public pressure surged again. Major news channels began airing analyses of the case. They invited former military officers, attorneys, and experts in police procedure. All reached the same conclusion: the fault lay with Randall. A former Marine stated on live television that using a gun out of emotion is a betrayal of the oath of both forces. The line spread widely, becoming the most shared quote of the night. The pressure forced the police department to abandon any hope of covering for him as before. Leadership had to meet through the evening to find a response. By the end of the day, they were compelled to issue an official statement that Randall Hale would be suspended and face the full legal process. The protective barrier Randall had relied on throughout his career collapsed in a single day. The community had witnessed everything, the military had intervened, and the investigative file was complete. His long slide had become a road with no return. 2 days after the investigation's conclusion was released, a small but solemn ceremony for Baxter was held in the courtyard of a K-9 training center. This was the place that had once welcomed Baxter during its early training phase, and also where its trainer used to wait every time Lyria brought it in for pre-mission evaluations. That morning, a light breeze drifted in from the fields behind the center, carrying the warm scent of grass Baxter used to love lying on whenever it was given a break. Lyria stood upright, her uniform washed clean of battlefield dust, though her eyes still carried the steady ache of someone who had just lost a teammate. In front of her stood a table draped in blue cloth, holding a small wooden plaque engraved with Baxter's name and the year it joined the K-9 force. The military emblem was carved in full, and beside it rested the collar that had accompanied it through countless missions. Lyria placed her hand on the plaque and held it there for a long moment, as though sending a final thank you. A special operations officer who had served with her read the farewell tribute. His voice was low and clear, each word sounding as though it touched everyone present. He spoke of the times Baxter crawled into dark tunnels, ran through minefields, and saved 3 teammates from a trap in the night. When he reached the moment Baxter was placed under Lyria's care after its final mission, his voice softened. It completed every assignment and protected its handler to its last breath. The line made those standing behind them bow their heads. When the roll call ended, Lyria stepped forward, took Baxter's collar, and lifted it to eye level. Hale. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, her breath slowing. In her mind, she could see Baxter running beside her across the red earth, its ears flicking whenever it heard the rotors of a helicopter, its even breathing like a reminder that it was always by her side. Lyria inhaled, then placed the collar back on the table. It marked the end of the ceremony and the moment Baxter would be taken into the K-9 Hall of Honor at the center. As she left the main area of the ceremony, neighbors from the street arrived. They stood in a long line along the path leading toward the parking lot. Some carried flowers, some held cards offering condolences, and some simply bowed their heads when she passed. Faces that had once watched Randall shouting in the street now carried unmistakable remorse. An elderly woman approached first. She held a small bouquet, her hands trembling. "Ms. Dawson, I'm sorry for what happened in our neighborhood." Lyria accepted the flowers gently and answered with a short but deeply respectful line. "I know you did the right thing by submitting the doorbell video." Mrs. Conway's eyes reddened, and she placed a hand on Lyria's arm as though asking the wind to carry the neighborhood's apology to Baxter. One by one, others stepped forward. A man who had said Randall once threatened his child bowed and apologized, his voice lowered by regret. Another admitted he had watched the video too many times and still felt pain every time the moment Baxter fell appeared. Their words made the atmosphere heavy but not sorrow-stricken, as though everyone was trying together to return a measure of overdue justice to a creature that had been loyal to its final breath. Amid the crowd, Evan stood tucked behind his mother's shoulder, his hands clasped together. He looked at Lyria from afar, then stepped forward slowly, his feet hesitating as though he feared he wasn't worthy of saying anything. When he finally stood before her, he lifted his face, his eyes red. "I recorded too late," Evan said, his voice trembling so hard that each word came out like a fragment. "If I'd been faster, maybe. I'm sorry." Lyria bent down and wrapped her arms around the boy as though holding a small piece of Baxter that still remained. In that embrace, she felt the weight inside him loosen. "You helped more than you think," she said, her voice soft as wind passing over grass. "Without you, the truth would never have been seen." Evan clutched her sleeve, his tears falling quietly but lighter than when he had first walked up to her. His mother stood beside him, wiping the corner of her eye before bowing her head to thank Lyria. "Thank you for telling him that," she said. "He hasn't slept for 2 nights. He kept thinking he was too late." Lyria straightened and looked toward the line of people waiting behind them. The late sunlight fell across the grass, casting warm streaks of gold. She knew her pain wouldn't fade in a day, but the presence of these people eased part of it. They weren't just apologizing for a dog being shot. They were apologizing for the silence that had allowed Randall to grow bolder every day. An NCIS officer approached to escort Lyria to her temporary lodging. He glanced at the line of neighbors, then spoke quietly to her. "This community owes you and Baxter a lot," she answered with a single nod. Her eyes closed for a brief second before she opened them again, like someone catching their breath after a long road. As she stepped into the vehicle, the neighbors remained standing in a long line, none of them leaving until the car began to move. Many placed a hand over their hearts, and a few offered a military-style salute, even though they weren't service members. The moment drew a solemn stillness over the entire K-9 Center. No one spoke, but everyone understood they were not only saying goodbye to a dog, but to a loyal teammate, a piece of a soldier that could never be replaced. Lyria looked through the window as the car rolled out of the grounds. The flowers in the neighbors' hands formed a long trail of color, like the path Baxter had left in their memory. She curled her fingers slightly and took a deep breath. Baxter's farewell ceremony had ended, but the strength it left behind was opening another chapter, one where justice no longer felt so far out of reach. And though the ache inside her had not yet closed, she knew she was no longer standing alone. News of Baxter's memorial spread quickly, becoming the spark that ignited the community's emotions stronger than ever. Images of Lyria standing beside Baxter's collar, her eyes filled with resolve mixed with grief, were shared across local news pages and military groups. The moment she held Evan in her arms during the ceremony left many viewers choked up. That clip circulated with the caption, "AK-9 fell," a boy stood up and a community changed. Just one day later, a petition calling for reform of the local patrol unit appeared online. It began as a small post from a resident living on the same street as Lyria, but within hours, the petition had been shared thousands of times. Its content demanded stricter oversight of patrol officers, mandatory body cams, and a full review of disciplinary histories within the department. Many people signed with short notes: for Baxter, for Major Dawson, for our safety. The words repeated like a quiet but powerful chorus. Those who once stayed silent about Randall's behavior now saw this as a chance for change. The abuse of authority in this case was no longer seen as an individual failing, but a wake-up call for the entire community. At the same time, dozens of residents began recounting their own experiences with Randall. A young man wrote that Randall stopped his car late one night merely for looking suspicious. A mother described how Randall pulled her over while she was driving her daughter to dance class only to ask meaningless questions before yelling at her. Another man wrote that Randall once filed an incorrect traffic report, forcing him to pay a fine for something he didn't do. Each story was small on its own, but together they formed a staggering, dark pattern. Readers of these accounts began to realize that what happened to Lyria and Baxter was not an isolated incident. It was simply the visible tip of a massive iceberg that residents had endured for years. One person wrote, "We were afraid of retaliation, so we didn't dare speak." It explained why Randall had felt bold enough to treat the street as his own territory. Meanwhile, the media pushed the story further. Reporters dug into Randall's work history. Files that had been closed quickly were reopened. They found suspicious notes buried in old reports, missing documentation, and complaints shoved into drawers without review. Articles carried strong headlines: years of neglect. The truth, the neighborhood never spoke aloud. A veteran journalist appeared on the evening news saying, "The problem isn't one officer, it's the system that let him exist this long." That line spread widely, gaining agreement from many. Outrage was no longer confined to the local community. It spread to nearby towns, to civil rights groups, and to police reform advocates across the state. Pressure from the community began rising to a level never seen before. Neighborhood meetings grew more crowded than usual. People stood shoulder to shoulder, filling the entire community room. Many said they had once wanted to report Randall, but every time they went to the station, they were met with dismissive looks or apathetic attitudes that discouraged them. Now, with Evan's video and the presence of NCIS, they felt safer speaking up. An elderly resident stood and addressed the meeting. "We stayed silent for too long. If not for Major Dawson and that video, what else would he have done, and who else would have become a victim?" The whole room went quiet for a few seconds before erupting into loud applause. The sound carried a decisive force, like a declaration that silence was no longer an option. Not only residents, but also social organizations stepped in. An animal rights group issued a statement demanding that the shooting of Baxter be handled with full severity. A veterans group wrote a letter directly to the police department reminding them that a combat K-9 is considered a soldier, and Baxter's death was an insult to everyone who had ever served. The letter was posted online and received tens of thousands of shares. Lyria did not join these discussions, but she received messages from strangers sending condolences and thanks. In her temporary room at the military center, she read them one by one, feeling each word like warmth seeping into the empty space inside her. She understood that her grief had become the driving force that pushed an entire community to stand up. That softened her heart a little. On the other side, the heat from the community left those who once covered for Randall unable to look away anymore. Several young officers at the station saw the public anger and knew they had to stand on the side of transparency. The older members of the force had had to admit that previous internal handling had allowed Randall to go far beyond acceptable limits. When the next press conference was held, hundreds of people gathered outside the police department holding signs and banners. They did not shout. They stood in silence, waiting for an explanation from leadership. That collective silence was more intimidating than chanting because it felt like the quiet patience of people who had been hurt for too long and were now demanding real change. In that tension stretched tight as a drawn string, a reporter said on a live broadcast, "The community's anger has reached its limit, and this time they will not accept any attempt at evasion from the police." Those words marked a crucial turning point. No one remained on the sidelines anymore. Everyone was aligned toward a single shared goal, forcing Randall to face accountability and pushing for reform so that no one would ever have to endure the kind of fear Lyria once experienced. The hearing was scheduled for the morning of Monday, when the pressure from the community had risen to a level that forced the police department to open the session for public viewing. The hearing room was packed, the back rows filled with residents, reporters, and groups of veterans who had stood with Lyria throughout the investigation. Every eye focused on the long table at the front, where the disciplinary council sat in a strict line. An empty chair was placed in the center of the room, reserved for Randall Hale. Randall entered with 2 officers escorting him. His face was pale, like someone who had not slept for many nights. The steps that once carried confidence were now slow and heavy, as if dragging behind them the years of abusive power he had tried to bury. When he sat in the chair for the respondent, he darted his eyes around. The looks from the rows behind made him instinctively shrink into himself. He had once been used to overpowering others with raised volume, but here he had nothing left to lean on. The chair of the disciplinary council opened the file before him and spoke in an even tone. "Today's hearing is to assess the conduct of Officer Randall Hale in the incident on," he read each detail clearly, each invoked statute. Words like unauthorized use of force, endangerment of civilians, and false reporting dropped into Randall's ears like cold stones. Every word made him curl inward a little more. When the introduction ended, the chair signaled the technician to prepare the evidence video. The moment the large screen on the right side of the room lit up, the entire hall held its breath. The video from Mrs. Conway's doorbell camera was played first. The wide-angle shot exposed Randall walking toward Lyria with a stance that showed unmistakable aggression. Baxter stood pressed against Lyria's leg, his body unmoving. The internal affairs investigator, standing beside the council table, pointed to the screen and explained each timestamp. At this moment, the dog does not move toward Officer Hale. This is a protective stance beside the handler. When the footage reached the part where Randall shoved Lyria's shoulder, a soft hiss rippled through the back rows like the pressure of days of anger, finally finding a crack to escape. A few people shook their heads, while others hardened their expressions. Randall stared at the screen, his hands clasped together under the table so tightly that the knuckles turned white. Evan's video was shown next. The moment Randall seized Lyria's wrist, his shouted words echoed clearly through the silent room. Even though everyone had seen the recording many times before, witnessing it again in person made the atmosphere sink further. When Baxter tugged lightly at the pant cuff and, warning an NCIS officer in the crowd, tilted his head, his eyes showing that the reaction was entirely consistent with trained combat K-9 protocol. The moment the gunshot sounded arrived. The image of Baxter collapsing made many people tighten their grip on their chair arms. A woman raised her hand to her mouth, trying to stifle a sob. In one corner of the room, someone bowed his head as if he were witnessing an old comrade fall. Lyria sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on the screen. Even though the pain had struck her heart many times already, that moment still pierced her like a freshly opened wound. When the video ended, the chair called for the witnesses. Evan stepped up first, his hand hands shaken so much that his phone clicked softly in his pocket. Yet, when he stood before the microphone, he took a deep breath and spoke clearly about what he had seen. "I started recording when he shoved Major Dawson. I did not see her attack. I did not see Baxter attack." Evan's voice cracked at the last sentence, but no one saw that as weakness. They saw in him a rare kind of courage. When Evan stepped down, Mrs. Conway was invited up. She held the microphone with both hands, her voice trembling lightly, but every word clear. "My doorbell camera recorded the beginning of the incident. I saw Officer Hale yelling loudly from the moment he arrived. I saw Major Dawson stay calm." She paused for a few seconds, then added, "I have lived near there a long time, and I know how he treats residents. That day, he pushed the situation too far." Her testimony turned many eyes toward Randall, as though waiting for his response. The chair looked at him and said, "You have the right to present your statement again." Randall inhaled deeply. He opened his mouth, trying to reclaim the authoritative tone he once used to overshadow others. "I acted on instinct for self-defense," he said. "The dog was about to attack." The chair raised a hand to stop him. The recording shows the opposite. He signaled the technician to replay the moment when Baxter only tugged lightly at the pant cuff. The entire room watched. Randall swallowed hard. He tried to twist the narrative again. She resisted a lawful order. The chair opened the file and presented the written record of 8 witness statements. No one confirms that. Randall bit his lip. He turned toward the crowd, his eyes filled with confusion mixed with anger. But the silence from the people behind him stood like a solid wall he could not break through. The disciplinary council continued questioning him about every contradiction in his statement. When they read the part where he claimed the dog lunged, the video again proved the opposite. When they asked why he drew his gun before assessing the situation, he had no clear answer. The stretches of silence that followed were long, heavy, and final, like the toll of a judgment bell. At last, the chair asked the final question, his voice calm but razor cold. "Do you have anything you wish to add to explain your actions in this video?" Randall opened his mouth but released only a heavy breath. He stared down at the table, his shoulders sagging as if all strength had drained from him. The answer he searched for did not come. Every justification he had clung to had collapsed beneath the truth displayed on the screen. The entire room remained utterly silent, waiting for him to say something, anything, even if only to salvage a shred of dignity. But Randall stayed silent, and that silence spoke more than any attempt at defense ever could. The chair struck the gavel to end the examination. People in the room stood feeling as though they had just witnessed the closing of a chapter in which Randall once held power. His face was vacant as he was escorted out, his eyes avoiding every gaze like a man with no way out. The hearing ended in an atmosphere that everyone understood justice had taken a long, decisive step forward. The hearing chamber that noon was so quiet that even the sound of the disciplinary board turning pages could be heard clearly. After reviewing all evidence and testimony, the board entered deliberation. Randall was escorted into the waiting room behind the chamber, sitting alone on a cold steel chair. He tried to avoid looking at the fogged mirror in front of him where his own face appeared exhausted, drained, and stripped of the aggression he once wore daily. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to clasp them together as though holding on to the last thread of hope. Inside the chamber, the board conducted a brief discussion. One member opened the file before him and reread the finalized conclusions: unlawful use of force, false reporting, abuse of authority in the encounter with a civilian and causing severe consequences. A veteran officer on the board stated plainly that the matter went far beyond internal discipline. The others agreed with no dissenting opinions. The consensus came quickly, so quickly that no debate was needed. The misconduct was unmistakably clear. When Randall was brought back into the chamber, his steps felt as heavy as if they were glued to the floor. Those in attendance stood silently watching him pass, their expressions no longer angry, but filled with disappointment and cold detachment. He could feel every stare distinctly like bright lights exposing the darkest corners of himself himself few had ever seen. The chair adjusted his glasses, looked at Randall, and read the decision. Based on the evidence, the testimony, and the conclusions of the disciplinary board, Officer Randall Hale is hereby permanently terminated from the police force. The words struck like the collapse of the final shelter Randall had clung to. Termination was heavy enough, but the chair continued, his voice steady and sharp. You are barred from serving in any agency related to law enforcement in any capacity. Randall sank back in his chair, his eyes widening as though unable to believe the words were real. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but the sound caught in his throat. The phrases he once used to overpower others no longer held any meaning in a room where every piece of evidence stood against him. The chair continued. In addition to administrative sanctions, the file will be forwarded to the Office of the District Attorney for consideration of criminal prosecution. The unlawful use of force resulting in the death of a K-9 combat dog and the filing of a false report fall within criminal liability under state law. A faint ripple of murmurs spread across the back of the room. Everyone understood this was a severe level of action, but fully warranted. Randall sat frozen, gripping the edge of his seat. His breathing grew unsteady, yet he did not dare react too strongly, knowing that any outburst would only make him appear even smaller before those watching. When the chair struck the gavel to conclude the session, the air grew thick. No one applauded, no one sighed, and only a heavy silence remained. It was a kind of silence Randall had never faced before. In the past, whenever he walked down the street, people were silent because they feared him. Now, they were silent because they despised him. Two officers approached and placed their hands on his elbows to escort him out. Randall stood up slightly unsteady, trying not to look at anyone. But even as he kept his eyes on the floor, he could still feel the gaze of dozens of people following each of his steps. The gaze of a community that had endured him for many years now ended in the moment he left the room like a man who had lost everything. In the long hallway, his footsteps echoed hollowly, each one sounding as though he were walking into a new judgment on his life. There were no more shouts, no more swagger. Only the large frame of a man shrinking into himself like the shadow of someone who had just been stripped of every ounce of authority he once abused. When the hearing room door closed behind him, there was a moment of absolute silence. The residents waiting outside watched Randall being led away, and no one spoke. Some of them had once been yelled at by him, others had listened to their children describe the fear of passing him during patrol. Now, they simply watched him leave as if witnessing the end of a long nightmare they had never been able to wake from before. Evan stood beside his mother, his hand gripping his old phone. He watched Randall being escorted past, and his eyes no longer held fear. Instead, there was the quiet understanding that justice sometimes comes late, but when it arrives, it strikes exactly where it needs to. Mrs. Conway stood nearby, nodding slightly as if telling herself that the truth had prevailed. Randall was taken to a police department vehicle to await the next steps in the transfer process. The car door opened. He paused for half a second, looking into the dark interior of the cabin. It looked no different from a small room with no exit. When he stepped inside, the door closing behind him sounded sharp and final, like the last door in his law enforcement life slamming shut. Though many outside wished for harsher punishment in that moment, the silence said everything. He had lost his authority, lost his uniform, lost his position, lost even the reason people once feared him. He left the hearing room with empty hands, carrying nothing but himself and the long chain of mistakes that had stretched across years. The image of Randall, sitting in the vehicle with his head bowed, unable to lift his gaze to anyone, closed the chapter of an abusive career the community had endured far too long. It also opened another where justice began to restore the boundaries he once erased. Many weeks had passed since the day Randall received his final disciplinary sentence. The neighborhood gradually returned to its usual rhythm, yet what had happened left a clear mark on every resident. From a place once overshadowed by the fear of an abusive officer, the street had become lively and connected in a way few could have imagined before. One weekend afternoon, Lyria returned to the community center at the invitation of the residents. They set up a large huge board outside the yard announcing a self-defense training program led by her. Chairs were arranged neatly, children stood in front with excited curiosity, and the adults paid close attention as if eager to learn something useful. When Lyria stepped in, many stood to greet her, with the military salute they had learned from the veterans during Baxter's farewell. The gesture made her smile softly. The center's coordinator introduced her to everyone. "Major Lyria Dawson has agreed to teach us self-defense skills and the proper way to respond in dangerous situations." His voice was warm and full of respect. The residents nodded, some looking at her as if she were someone who had pulled them out of the shadows. Lyria stepped forward and began the session with the simplest principles. Every movement she demonstrated was gentle and clear, not as heavy as what she once used on the battlefield, but suited for ordinary civilians. She taught how to break free from a pull, how to use body weight for balance, how to call for help at the right moment, and how to stay calm when threatened. No one took their eyes off her, and every question was answered with careful clarity. When the session ended, many people came forward to thank her. A young mother holding her child said that ever since the incident, she had learned to speak up instead of avoiding confrontation. An older man shared that he had always believed age made him weak, but seeing her today made him feel he could still protect his family in his own way. Their words made Lyria feel that her pain had become a source of strength for others. A few days later, Lyria visited a K-9 center at the manager's invitation. It was a place that trained and cared for dogs who had completed their missions and were nearing retirement. They led her through the row of spacious kennels where each dog lay resting on clean mats under the warm afternoon sun. Every one of them bore traces of long service, yet their eyes were calm with steady loyalty. The manager brought her to a small kennel where a gray-gold dog lifted its head to look at her. "His name is Ranger," he said. "He retired 2 months ago because of a minor injury. Good spirit, even temperament, suitable to live with a veteran like you." Ranger's tail flicked gently, his eyes studying Lyria with soft curiosity. She knelt, placed her hand on the bars, and Ranger stepped forward, resting his head in her palm as if they had known each other for a long time. The moment was gentle yet deep. A quiet sense of fullness slipped into the space Baxter had left behind. She looked at the dog and softly said, "Welcome to the team." The manager nodded when he saw the certainty in her eyes. They completed the transfer paperwork that very afternoon. Ranger followed her home with steady steps, as if understanding that he was beginning a new journey. Ranger's presence quickly brought life back into the otherwise quiet home. He lay beside the door every morning, followed her into the yard each afternoon, and always stood close by her leg whenever someone came to visit. Ranger did not replace Baxter, but continued the role of a teammate, easing the hollow in her chest and bringing her a calmer breath after the long, tense weeks. Meanwhile, the neighborhood gradually changed for the better. Community meetings became more proactive. More people stood up to share ideas and propose ways to protect their families and neighbors. Stories about Randall were no longer to be fearful whispers tales, but lessons on refusing to tolerate injustice. Children in the neighborhood were taught how to call for help in dangerous moments and where to seek safety. Adults formed a community watch network. That sense of unity created a security none of them once believed they could achieve. One late afternoon, Lyria and Ranger walked along the trail behind the houses. The sky shifted to a warm gold, the last light of day washing over the trees and giving the scene a strangely peaceful hue. Ranger stayed close occasionally, turning his head to make sure she was still beside him. Lyria stopped at the path leading to the open field where she once stood watching the traffic pass after Baxter's memorial. She lifted her eyes to the sky as it bled gently into shades of orange. In that quiet moment, she said a sentence to herself and to everything that had happened. Justice is not fast, but it always arrives. The evening wind carried the words away as if delivering the closing line of the journey she had lived through. Ranger sat beside her, his ears slightly raised when he heard her voice. Lyria placed a hand on his head, stroking him in a familiar gesture. A sense of calm settled over them both, like a sign that the long stretch of tension and grief had reached its end, opening a new chapter in her life. Before her was an open sky, and beside her was a new teammate. After everything, Lyria understood that no matter how harsh life could be, decent people and steady resolve could still bring justice where it was needed to go. The story of Major Lyria Dawson did not close with shouting nor with a blazing sentence, but with the transformation of an entire community once standing at the edge of fear. From the fateful noon, when Randall Hale received a false call and unleashed his anger on a black woman, to the moment the gunshot ended Baxter's life, the entire neighborhood had witnessed what they had avoided for far too long. That power placed in the wrong hands becomes an invisible weapon, forcing ordinary people to live in caution. Lyria's journey did not begin in the posture of a hero. She was simply a soldier returning from the battlefield, weary yet composed, carrying a combat dog she regarded as family. She stopped her car to help a boy who had fallen, a small gesture of kindness. But that small act became the starting point of a chain of events that would completely upend her life. Randall appeared like the shadow of corruption. His shouting, his scrutinizing stare, and his air of disdain were nothing new to the neighborhood. The difference was that this time he confronted someone whose calm could not be broken. Lyria neither retaliated nor retreated. Her steady demeanor inadvertently pushed him past his limits. When Baxter stepped forward to protect his handler, the only thing that surfaced in Randall was the desire to impose power, not to preserve safety. The gunshot that day did not merely kill a dog. It struck the year-off silence across the entire neighborhood, tore through the layer, hiding incidents buried because people feared trouble and feared retaliation. But that moment also sparked the first light when Evan lifted his phone and recorded everything. A child, driven by an instinct for justice, pulled an entire community out of fear. As the video spread, residents realized they were no longer alone. The footage accidentally captured the military police tattoo on Lyria's arm, triggering the arrival of NCIS and drawing out the truth about her identity. A woman who had faced danger on distant battlefields had been insulted on an ordinary street. That contrast touched the pride of many. The outrage came not only from Baxter's death, but also from the fact that a special operations officer had been treated with prejudice. The investigation revealed layer after layer of truth. Randall's old files, the stories once buried, the residents who had once stayed silent, all stepped forward to name his actions. Truth is like water. The more it is pressed down, the harder it surges up. The public hearing brought everything into the open. Randall could not use lies to obscure the video, nor use a domineering glare to drown out witness testimony. In the end, he was stripped of what he had always treated as absolute power. When he walked out of the hearing room in silence, it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of justice completing its role. But the most memorable part was not the sentence handed to Randall. More important was the change within each resident, from a child like Evan to Mrs. Conway to those who quietly rose to sign the petition for patrol reform. Baxter's passing ignited the determination of the entire neighborhood, helping them understand that protecting one another is a responsibility, not a privilege. Lyria, too, found her own form of healing. After Baxter's farewell ceremony, she taught self-defense to the community and adopted Ranger, a retired K-9. Ranger did not replace Baxter, but his presence gave her a new point of steadiness. He was a reminder that even after loss, trust can be rebuilt. The neighbors were no longer timid whenever they heard a patrol car. They knew how to speak up, knew their rights, and knew that unity was the strongest shield. People no longer entrusted their safety to luck. They actively protected their families, their neighborhoods, and themselves with a newfound awareness. The story of Lyria and Baxter was not something grand. It was an ordinary story about a woman taking her dog to the vet, about a boy who wanted to do the right thing, about neighbors who had once been too afraid, and about a police officer who believed authority existed to be displayed. But it was precisely that simplicity that turned the story into a mirror, reflecting a reality that many places are facing. From here came a few quiet but weighty lessons. Justice does not appear instantly, but it always finds the right path as long as someone dares to keep the door open for it. Power without restraint breeds cruelty, and cruelty ends only when people step out of silence. Kindness may be the beginning of a chain of events no one expects, but kindness has never been something to regret. A strong community is one that protects the vulnerable and knows how to correct itself after staying silent for too long. And in the end, Baxter's love and loyalty reminded everyone that sometimes the deepest lessons come from beings who cannot speak. It was his sacrifice that made justice easier to see. That afternoon, as Lyria stood beside Ranger and watched the sky change colors, she understood clearly that this journey was not only for her or for Baxter. It was the journey of the entire neighborhood, of those who had been afraid, who had been shouted at, who once thought their voices held no value. And finally, she knew she had passed through the storm to see a new horizon. She gently repeated the words she once told herself: justice is not fast, but it always comes. And this time it came through the unity of an entire community.